Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Founding Lore Fathers. I am your host, Richard, and unfortunately, my co hosts, John and Dan, aren't able to make it tonight for some personal reasons. So I'm going to push through this, do my best as a solo podcast. And I'm going to be talking about a historical person that I find to be very fascinating. Tonight, I'm going to be telling you about King James I, the bastard who gave us the Bible and sparked the massive wave of witch hunts across Scotland and England. So now King James is, the first, his main claim to fame is he was the first person to authorize the mass production of the Bible. And there are several other hysterical things that happened to him. And there's also a lot of crazy things that happen, which is, you know, pretty, pretty on course for a King of England. But one of the things I do want to get out of the way before we start getting into like his life and all that kind of stuff is there is a great conspiracy theory out there that he was the first black king of England. And that's a theory that's floating around the interwebs. And it argues that, well, he was the first black person as king. Now it's pretty easy to see that this is like overwhelmingly false statement, but you can spend hours on YouTube listening to members of like the Black Israelites go on about how history is trying to steal this important figure from the rest of the world. Now, I don't recommend you do that, but I'm not going to be mad at you if you do, because I mean, they're really passionate about it. And as I've said before, if you don't want to believe something that's crazy, you probably shouldn't watch videos about things that are crazy, because they will convince you that something like that's real. So, although the Bible is his main claim to fame, what a lot of people don't know about this king is that he was, before the Bible came out, at least his version anyway, he wrote a book called Demonology. Now, that book was used as the foundation to kill, I mean, thousands of people, primarily women, during the height of the witch hysteria that swept across England, and some can argue the United States as well. Now, some other fun facts about him is he was openly bisexual, and he's known as the most prominent gay person of that era. Now, he was married. He was in fact married to Anne of Denmark, but he was known to have several extramarital affairs with men collectively known as the king's favorite. The most notable of which was George Villiers, which is somebody who he made the Duke of Buckingham. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't know exactly how those titles work in England, but I do know that Duke sounds pretty official to me, and I imagine that came with quite a few perks. Now, his full name, James Charles Stewart, he's was born on June 19th in 1566 to Mary, Queen of the Scots, and Henry Stewart, Lord of Darlany. It's a weird word over there. I can't pronounce that if I tried. Now, his great grandfather was King Henry VII. He was the King of England and Lord of Ireland, positioning James to be the potential heir of all three crowns. So, England, Scotland, and Ireland. Now, his father was murdered in an explosion, and the prime suspect was a guy named Earl of Brothel, who a year later would go on to marry his wife Mary. So Henry's mom. So at the ripe age of 13 months, his mom was suspected of killing his father, and the people forced her to get vacate the throne, and that made her son the king. But at being 13 months old, James wasn't actually in command of the kingdom, because even back then, leaving a baby in charge of the world would somehow be crazier than people using witchcraft. Um, but I think the crazier thing about that is, like, this dude clearly has some mommy issues like the rest of us. Like the act of his mom getting arrested, um, put people. It was a privy council from Scotland, and it was led by this guy named George Buchanan, who was somehow managed to be worse than an angry queen who bombs people. So, um, it's, it's interesting how his life shaped that way. So now Buchanan, he is a historical figure in his own right. Um, but some of his highlights are is that Buchanan, um, also, he's an established intellectual, and he would advocate for political power for the people rather than monarchs. Um, Buchanan played a role. He actually helped prosecute James's mother, the Queen of the Scots, and he was also known to beat the shit out of James regularly and did his best to turn the king into someone who accepted the limitations of his power. And as you'll find out, that didn't exactly work. So that's right. So, like, one of the key figures in locking up his mom, the queen, also played a pivotal role in raising and abusing him. And I'm sure none of that had a lasting impact on his worldview. Now, I'm just kidding. It totally did. So, one of James's first act as King of Scotland, when he finally did get power, was called the Black Axe. Now, the law established that the king had power over everything, including religion, and that gave him the right to decide when Parliament should hold assemblies. And he took that even a step further, and he wrote an essay titled "The True Law of Free Monarchs," which lays out the legal groundwork for "I am the king by divine right." Not obviously isn't a new concept, but to actually put it in writing and have a law to support it is something that needed to be done to help, I guess, that version of England push those laws along, keep moving the bureaucracy along the way. Now, there are scholars that believe this is the first time this idea wasn't firmly established in Scotland. However, so I mean, talk about a massive like fuck you to Buchanan. I mean, I just can't imagine how satisfying that was for James. Like, I mean, it would have been interesting to see how things would have turned out, like if this guy had been loved as a child instead of beaten by a guy who put his mom in prison. Yeah, but you know, he was king by divine right, so history's fun. Anyway, so James eventually got married, and it was either in like 1589 or 1590 that he married Anne of Denmark, whose father was King Frederick. Now, Frederick had an interesting story, and we could probably do an entire episode on him as well. And maybe I'll look into that at some point. But for now, the most important thing you need to know about him is that he made it law of the land to burn heretics, and boy, did they do some burning. So anyone who was subversive to the church, it was cool to burn them. Now, to get to his wife, the king had to travel to her kingdom, where at some point during the voyage they experienced a terrible storm. Now, James believe this was an assassination attempt by witches. It's unclear to me how he came to that conclusion, but I do know that witchcraft was in everyone's mind at the time. So, maybe it was just paranoia from the guy. It's pretty unclear for that. Now, somehow, some way, they end up choosing these two women, but we know these poor women confessed to causing the storm in an effort. But what I do know is that these two women confessed to causing the storm in an effort to kill the queen. What I don't know, and what history doesn't know, is that James took an interest in the case and even personally interrogated the woman. One was named Agnes Sampson. Now, she was considered the elder witch of the accused group that confessed, and she confessed under torture. So that's a pretty common theme when it comes to the witch trials. Um, the story goes that she confessed directly to the king, but he wasn't buying it. And when he called her a liar, she whispered something in his ear that only his wife would know. Now, the events that followed would become known as the North Berwick witch trials. The initial two women who were tortured eventually gave up the names of five other women, all of whom were convicted and burned at the stake. And this is a pretty pivotal moment in Scottish history because specifically because of the king's involvement. Now, because he was involved, it became big news and it sparked several outbreaks of witch hysteria across Scotland, leading to the deaths of hundreds of people. Now, I think it's important to note that this isn't where the witch trials like originated. People had been hunting witches for some time. In Denmark, the practice of violently murdering witches had already started to pick up. These hunts were largely inspired by Heinrich Kramer, a German Catholic clergyman who was serving in the Dominican order in 1486. So this is, 40, 50 years beforehand. The clergyman actually wrote a legal guide to witch hunting and persecuting. It was called the Malus Maleficum, which loosely translates to the Hammer of Witches. Now, Heinrich's book begins with a statement issued by the Pope Innocent the Fourth, and I believe this is called a papal bull. Catholicism, I don't know anything about it, but I believe that's the terminology that's used for it. And in it, the Pope writes, um, "It has recently come to our ears, not without great pain to us, that in some parts of Upper Germany, many persons of both sexes, heedless of their own salvations and forsaking the Catholic faith, give themselves over to the devils, male and female, and by their incantations, charms, and conjurings, and by abominable superstitions and shortages, offenses, crimes, and misdeeds, ruin and cause to perish the offspring of women, the fowls of animals, the products of the earth, the grapes of the vine, and the fruits of the trees, as well as other men and women, cattle and flocks and herds, and animals of every kind." So we all know that whatever the Pope says comes from God. That's how they look at that type of thing. So you don't want to disobey God, do you? I mean, I think that's an important line in there is that one about the offspring of women. It's a classic think of the children moment. That seems to be a recurring theme when justifying the killing of a bunch of people, and even just like, yeah, it's a weird thing there. But I just can't state how important it is that you actually take the Pope's words and put it in front of a book about persecuting and hunting witches, because that gives a lot of power to it. Now, shortly after the king and queen would turn to Scotland, there was a man named David Seaton. He accused his housemaid, who had been sneaking out at night and had the power to heal. He accused her of being the witch. Now, he and the other townspeople tortured the young lady and with something called a pillywinkles. Yeah, which is it's a pretty strange thing. So it's like hand screws. They're designed to break fingers, and that's the way things worked in the good old days. So that's pretty awful. When uh, when she didn't confess, they moved to a more advanced torture techniques, such in modern days, I guess we would call enhanced interrogation techniques. Um, Yay, America! So the most critical part about the confession is that she admitted to working with the Denmark witches in order to kill the king. So there's the connection right there. Roughly 100 people were accused and tortured and murdered for the assassination plot. Following the initial trials, witch hunting spread across Scotland, leading to several other high-profile witch hunts. So it's all kind of this weird connection right there. So now these events are what inspired James to write the infamous Demonology, which again is another example of the king giving the thumbs up to hunt down and kill witches. And I mean, the book covers topics um like why there are more women than men practicing witchcraft. There's which is incredibly sexist. It's because women have more time to, or have less things to do, so they have more time to talk, which means that when they're talking more, so when the devil talks to one of them, they can't help but spread rumors and gossip about it. So that's why there are more women witch than men witch. Um, this is also where we start seeing things like swimming the witch, which if you're not familiar, is the famous techniques of if she floats, she's a witch. If she sinks, she isn't. So, but the demonology, I will say, is James's attempt to present a rational view of the witch trials, where accusers needed to ensure that those who were falsely accused didn't get tortured as badly or burned alive. And this is kind of on theme with James because he wanted to be known as a an intelligent man, a man of a scholar. So the book's actually it's actually a pretty interesting read because it's not just laying out what is right, what is wrong. He actually wrote it in a way that it's actually a pretty quick read, where it's two people talking about situations, but it is an old English, so it can be burdensome to read it. But now this sounds reasonable. Like if you live in a world where witches are definitely real and pose an imminent threat to you and your family. Now, in fact, inside the book, the first part of the book, he lays out the biblical argument for the existence of witches, filled with citations from the Bible. And his general argument is that Catholics practice our practices and traditions are used to communicate with spirits, and if they can do it, then a reasonable person can only assume that the devil can contact you the same way. Excuse me. The methods described in James' books were, I mean, they were used long after his death. And Britain's most notorious witch hunter, a bastard named Matthew Hopkins, he was a dude who got caught up in the witch movement, and he's the self-proclaimed witch hunter general. Now, I mean, the dude would help torture and kill hundreds of innocent people, again, primarily women, while he was collecting fees per person found guilty of witchcraft in a court of law. So that's right. Like, I mean, I mean, he's an old school witch hunting grifter. Like, I mean, he became pretty wealthy just going around torturing people, into false confessions. It's what a dick. What a complete and utter asshole. Now, Hopkins was also one of the reasons why the witch trials ended because when when the money guys for towns, the accountants started looking at like how much money they had spent on these witch trials, like the math wasn't math and they were killing off people, they were generating less taxes and they were paying people to torture people. And so ultimately it came down to there wasn't enough money to keep going on with the witch hunts. And you can thank Hopkins for that because he was so good at taking money out of these people's hands. Anywho, so 6 years after the book was published, Queen Elizabeth would die. Now that left the England to James. The king inherited was, I mean, it was full of religious tensions between the Catholic Church and then at the time the rapidly growing Protestant denominations. And to kind of give you an idea of how tense things were, James's mom was only jailed for her role for blowing up her husband for 7 years. And scholars attributed Mary's, I'm sorry, I misspoke there. So James's mom was jailed for her role in blowing up her husband, and then several years later, scholars attributed Mary's beheading to Queen Elizabeth's belief that Mary was the Catholic threat to Elizabeth's Protestant kingdom. So Protestants not thinking or thinking Catholics were a threat. I mean, that's continued on. I mean, Jesus Christ, JFK had that going on right there. There were people who said he couldn't be president because he was loyal to the Pope. So this is a tale as old as time. So and one of the other kind of things that's right here is I like the idea that the only thing more dangerous than an influential person's interpretation of the Bible is another person's interpretation of the Bible, of the exact same Bible. So in 1603, just a few years after Mary was executed, Elizabeth got hers when she died, unmarried, childless, and without naming an heir, which opened the door up for Mary's son James to be next in line for the throne. And this marks the end of the Tudor monarchy, and this also ushered in the Stuart reign, which would last like I guess another 100 years. And there are some real shithead Stuarts out there. So, um, now I think it's also important to bring up that when James took the throne, he became known as the Union of Crowns because like as the Scottish Museum, like the museum's website points out, his reign produced the first Anglo-Scottish union, though it wasn't like a full political union, which helped form the background of like the formal, like, I guess, merging of the kingdoms in 1707. So, one of the things that the people of England were looking for in their new king was the loosening of some of the constraints that Queen Elizabeth had enacted. And an idea that James was, I mean, he was, not cool with, if I'm to be frank with you. He firmly believed in absolute rule alongside with religious controls, and he decided to do this through the bishops and the churches. Now, this didn't sit well with the nation's like political and religious people there. So, and as a result, like during the first 2 years of his reign in power, there were several assassination attempts. One attempt included Sir Walter Raleigh, which is the name of the capital of North Carolina. So he was convicted and eventually beheaded for his role in the failed attempt on the king's life. So that's a little fun fact for you, for my North Carolina crowd. These assassination attempts led King James to make an executive decision to expel all Catholic priests from the island nation. And all this accomplished was it was just basically just throwing fuel on the fire. Now, as luck would have it, the increased political and religious squabbles were also a driving force behind one of the most famous assassination attempts of all time, the Gunpowder Plot. Now, many of you will know this as the inspiration for V for Vendetta. The guy used, and the anonymous group Face Mask was inspired by Guy Fawkes, and he's obviously the most famous of the conspirators. And although Fawkes and his merry band of Catholics failed to take down the Protestant king, they also failed to turn the Catholic Guard against him. So, because of the Guard's religion, James was able to recognize that, this was not an attempt by the church, but rather a few radicals. And the country, took a collective breath of relief. I mean, I can only imagine how history would have changed if he felt the church was coming for him. And, here he is, king, he's got all the power in the world at the time. But in the middle of all this political turmoil and religious uncertainty, James decided to commission the translation of and publication of the King James Bible. And this is just a few short years after assuming power. Now, the king did this hoping that a uniformed Bible interpretation would help solidify his power and ease tension in the country. Years later, this decision would help undermine the power of the monarchy because, as it turns out, there were certain parts of the Bible leaders of the church conveniently left out of their sermons, like passages that question the power of the king or the idea that the king should collect so much silver and gold. But that would happen years after James had already passed away. But I don't know. Let's get back to it. So in the years that followed the assassination attempts, James grew tired of dealing with Parliament, and in the year 1611, he suspended the organization. And this decision would have a lasting impact on the kingdom. At some point in the decision, Um, as playing as it played a role in the deepening religious extremism, leading to a new wave of witch hunts erupting. Yeah, this included one of the most significant trials in England's history. These are the Pendle trials. And what kicked off these trials was one of the history's worst coincidences. So there was a teenage beggar named Alison DeVise, and she asked an older man who was traveling through her town for some food. When he ignored her, she cursed him. And I mean, almost simultaneously, the man had a stroke. Now, obviously, the conclusion is that the spell worked, and she blew up his mind. So, yeah, I can't imagine what that must have been like for that girl. Because usually, like, I know when I curse strangers that don't share with me, I'm usually very disappointed in the results. So, yeah, shout out to her. But this stroke was, yeah, the stroke was unbelievably bad luck, and this girl's entire family ended up being accused of being witches. The trial ensued, and for a while, it looked like most of the women would be let go for their crimes, and that is until demonology reared its ugly head again. So the prosecution brought out a 9-year-old Elizabeth Device who accused her entire family of being witches. Now, I'm not going to lie and say I'm an expert in English law, but what my sources had pointed out was at the time children weren't allowed to testify. But James's book points to children as a reasonable source for information about witches. The little girl's testimony was accepted, and the women were subjected to being hanging by a short drop, which, if you don't know, is probably the worst way to get hanged. This is when the fall isn't long enough to snap your neck, so you just have to suffocate under your own body weight. So yeah, aren't you glad you missed out on this era in human history? I know I am. So, but yeah, I can only imagine the prosecutors. Yeah, I can't. It's hard to say how they got this little girl to confess to her entire family being witches, but history moved on. But James's religious and political policies, and just the kind of the terrifying reality of living in England at the time. Now, this inspired the Puritans to become pilgrims, and they ended up setting sail for the colonies. Now, their descendants of the escapees were smart enough to build their new country free from religious control and pointless culture wars. And they certainly never used religion as a reason to suppress or murder a bunch of people ever again. God, we really don't learn from anything in history, do we? But yeah, there's a quick rundown of King James for you guys. You know, it's real bastard in history. So, well, you guys, thank you for listening, and please like and share the show.